The world outside her window was a symphony of life, each note a vibrant, taunting reminder of a melody she could no longer hear. Evelyn pressed her forehead against the cool glass, her breath fogging a small circle on the pane. Down in the sun-drenched courtyard, vendors called out their wares, children's laughter echoed off the cobblestones, and packs of young warriors, their forms fluid with the promise of the shift, moved with a freedom that made her chest ache. This was the kingdom of Meldivia, alive and pulsing with an energy that thrummed through the very stone of the manor, yet it all stopped dead at the threshold of her room. Once, this house had echoed with that same music. Once, her father's deep, rumbling laugh would have filled these halls, a sound so warm and solid it could chase away the deepest shadows of the long, howling winters. After her mother's gentle light had faded, that laughter had gone with it for a time. Then came Elizabeth, with her polished smiles and cool, capable hands. She had not replaced her mother. No one could. But she had restored a rhythm to their lives. And when Gwen was born, a squalling, pink-faced bundle of joy, the final, fractured piece of their family, had seemingly clicked into place. Two sisters, one with hair of summer gold and the other with waves of deep autumn brown, became inseparable. Princesses of their own small, happy domain, protected by their father's gentle, unwavering rule. The day he died was the day the music stopped. The silence that fell was not one of grief, but of something far more insidious. It began subtly, a lingering touch on her shoulder, a voice laced with sympathetic concern. "You look pale, my dear," Elizabeth would murmur, steering her away from visiting nobles. "The grief has weakened your form. Best to rest." And so, Evelyn had rested. She sipped the bitter tea Elizabeth brought her, each cup a draught of deepening fatigue. The vibrant girl who could run with the best of them grew pale, her hands developing a faint, constant tremor. The outing ceased. The invitations were politely declined. "She isn't well," Elizabeth would tell the curious, her voice a masterful blend of sorrow and maternal duty. And all the while, the wolf's bane, a ghost of a scent hidden beneath honey and lemon, did its silent, cruel work. It was a calculated poison, enough to leach the strength from her limbs, to cloud the sharpness in her mind, but never enough to kill, just enough to hide. Her world shrank to the four walls of her room. The view from her window a cruel portrait of a life she was forced to observe but never touch. Her only solace was found in the crackling spines of old books and the fierce, whispered loyalty of the household maids, women who remembered her mother and served her father. They were her silent army. On those rare, precious afternoons when Elizabeth and Gwen were swept away by the demands of noble society, they would work their magic. A back gate would be left unbarred. A watchful eye would be turned away, and for a few, stolen hours, Evelyn would escape. The air outside the manor walls was different. It smelled of baking bread and forge fire, of earth and honest sweat. The farmers in the market would bow, not out of obligation to a title, but out of genuine respect for the girl they remembered. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man with a voice like grinding stone, would pause his hammering to offer her a warm, freshly forged trinket. Here, among the ordinary folk whose lives were built on strength and survival, she found a warmth, an authenticity, that the cold, polished halls of her home had never offered. It fed a hidden part of her soul, even as her body, still humming with the residual poison, warned her she could never stay out for long. This secret life was her rebellion, a flickering candle in the overwhelming darkness Elizabeth had crafted for her. It was the only thing that proved she was still alive. The return to her gilded cage was always a physical pain, a slow leaching of color from the world. The moment she slipped back through the manor's rear gate, the weight of her isolation would settle upon her shoulders once more, heavier than before. The lingering scent of sun-warmed stone and fresh herbs on her skin felt like a smuggled secret, a tangible piece of the world she was forbidden to have. Inside, the silence was a living thing, thick and suffocating. She would climb the stairs, her legs already beginning to feel the familiar, leaden weakness, a reminder that her vitality was on borrowed time. By the time she reached her room, The vibrant girl who had laughed with the blacksmith was gone, replaced once again by the pale, trembling creature confined to her quarters. It was during these hours of enforced quiet that Gwen would visit, a burst of perfumed energy and silken gowns. She would float into Evelyn's room, her eyes bright with the reflected glamour of the world outside, a world Evelyn was only permitted to hear about secondhand. "You should have seen Lord Theron's son, Eve," Gwen would begin, settling onto the edge of the bed, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "He tried to recite poetry, but he completely botched the last line. Everyone was too polite to laugh, but I saw Lady Isabel cover her smile with her fan." Evelyn would listen, propped against her pillows, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. She loved her sister, loved the unburdened joy she carried, but a chasm was widening between them, paved with Gwen's innocent ignorance. She truly believed the story their stepmother had crafted, that a profound, lingering grief was the invisible chain keeping Evelyn bound to this room. "You spend too much time in stuffy ballrooms," Evelyn would tease gently, her voice softer, lacking its former robust energy. "You should come with me someday. The real kingdom is out there, Gwen, in the markets. You can taste the warmth of the bread from the ovens, feel the heat of the forge on your skin. They have stories that would make Lord Theron's son's poetry seem like a child's nursery rhyme." Gwen's nose would wrinkle in delicate distaste. "And get dust on my slippers. Eve, be serious. Besides, Mother says it's not safe for us there. There are rough sorts." Her concern was always laced with that subtle programming. Elizabeth's poison delivered in words instead of wolfsbane. "I worry about you enough as it is. You need your rest, not more excitement." And Evelyn would fall silent, the words dying in her throat. How could she explain the profound safety she felt among those rough sorts? How could she describe the strength that flowed into her from their genuine smiles, a strength that momentarily fought back the creeping weakness? She saw the love in Gwen's eyes, a love tangled with pity. She was two people, the fading noble daughter in the eyes of her family, and the beloved secret princess in the heart of the kingdom. And the distance between those two girls was growing with every passing poisoned day. The fragile peace of Evelyn's secluded world shattered not with a crash, but with a whisper. It began as a low, worried hum among the maids as they dusted, a tension in the set of the guard's shoulders at the gate. Then, the whispers became words, slithering under doorways and through the cracks in the window frames, carried on the same air that brought the scent of rain and blooming night flowers. A king who could not walk. A king whose mind was said to be as fractured as his body. A king who had never been seen in his wolf form. A silent, shameful truth that spoke louder than any rumor. Alpha King Julius, they murmured, was a broken symbol, placed on the throne by the iron will of his formidable mother, Queen Helen, and now he needed a Luna. The announcement from the palace, delivered on stiff official parchment, sent a tremor through every noble house in Meldivia. Once, the title of Luna was the highest honor a she-wolf could aspire to, a chance to stand beside power and glory. Now, it was a sentence. To be bound for life to a cripple, to a king mocked in his own streets, to share a throne that was seen as little more than a gilded cage. It was a fate no family wished upon their daughter. And so the cold, elegant solution was devised, a casting of lots. Fate, in its impartial cruelty, would choose the sacrificial lamb. Fear, sharp and acrid, permeated the manor. Evelyn observed it from her window, watching the hurried, anxious comings and goings of noble messengers. She saw the way Elizabeth's smile became a tight, strained line, the way her hands clenched around her skirts. Gwen had fled the final gathering of the noble houses and came to Evelyn's room, her face as pale as the moonlight streaming through the glass. She clutched Evelyn's frail hand, her own fingers ice cold. "What if it's us, Eve?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "What if our name is drawn?" Her eyes were wide with a terror Evelyn had never seen in her before. "Can you imagine it? Chained to a helpless king, to be pitied by the entire kingdom, to never know a true mate's bond, to only have a caretaker's duty." She painted a grim picture of a life of silent suffering, of a throne room that felt like a tomb. Evelyn, nestled in the cocoon of her own perceived safety, merely offered a faint, weary smile. She gave her sister's hand a weak squeeze. "Don't borrow trouble from tomorrow, Gwen. Look at me." She gestured to her own thin form, the delicate tremor in her wrist that never quite subsided. "I am the sick one, the invalid. The lot will never fall to me. It's you who represents our house. You are the one they all see." She had meant it to be comforting, a logical reassurance that the burden would not be hers to bear. But the words landed on Gwen's raw nerves like a physical blow. The color drained completely from her face, and she pulled her hand back as if burned. The unintended truth of it, that Evelyn's illness made her the safe one, the spared one, crystallized Gwen's fear into a cold, sharp dread. That night, Evelyn slept the untroubled sleep of the condemned who does not know her fate is sealed. But down the hall, Gwen lay awake, staring at the canopy of her bed, her mind racing over her sister's words. "It's you." The two simple sentences coiled around her heart, squeezing tighter with every beat, until the fear was no longer a distant possibility, but a phantom already wrapping its cold hands around her throat. The seed of a terrible, desperate solution had been planted, and in the fertile soil of that fear, it began to take root. The phantom of fear tightened its grip around Gwen's throat until she could no longer breathe. She did not sleep. She watched the moon trace its path across the sky, her mind a frantic, terrified chorus of what if, what if, what if. By the time the first gray light of dawn bled into the room, the fear had hardened into a single, desperate resolution. She had to see her mother. She found Elizabeth in her morning room, sipping tea and reviewing household accounts as if the world were not teetering on the edge of an abyss. The words tumbled out of Gwen in a choked, frantic rush. Her terror, the imagined horror of a life shackled to a broken king, and finally, Evelyn's calm, devastating assumption that Gwen would be the one chosen. Elizabeth listened, her expression unreadable, until Gwen finished, collapsing into a chair with a sob. "I cannot do it, Mother. I would rather die." A long, calculating silence filled the room. Then Elizabeth placed her cup down with a precise, soft click. "There is a way," she said, her voice low and devoid of its usual maternal warmth. It was the tone of a strategist assessing a battlefield. "The lot falls upon a house, but the house chooses which daughter to offer." Gwen stared, uncomprehending. "But there is only me. Evelyn is too ill. Everyone knows it. She cannot even leave her room." "Exactly." Elizabeth's eyes, sharp as shards of ice, pinned her daughter in place. "Her illness is the key, but it must be managed. Are you willing to do what is necessary to save yourself? Are you willing to sacrifice the bond you have with your sister?" The question hung in the air, toxic and heavy. Gwen felt a cold dread slither down her spine. "What do you mean?" "The weakness," Elizabeth stated, her voice flat. "It is not grief, it is wolf's bane. A little in her tea, every day, to keep her pale, to keep her hidden." The world tilted. Gwen recoiled, a hand flying to her mouth as if to physically stop the horrifying truth from entering her. The memory of 1,000 cups of tea, of her mother's soothing hands bringing comfort to her ailing sister, twisted into something monstrous. A single, hot tear of pure horror escaped and traced a path down her cheek. You poisoned her?" "I protected you," Elizabeth snapped, her composure cracking for a single, furious instant. "I kept her from being a rival, from drawing suitors away from you, and now that same protection can save you from this farce of a king. But you must choose, Gwen. Your comfort or your sister's. Your future or your conscience." Gwen looked into her mother's eyes and saw no remorse, only a ruthless, chilling practicality. The fear was a live wire in her chest, burning away the horror, the guilt. It was a choice between Evelyn's freedom and her own. The selfish, terrified part of her won. "I'll do anything," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. It was in that moment of damning confession that Rosie, dusting the hall outside, froze. Her blood ran cold. The polishing cloth slipped from her numb fingers, falling to the floor without a sound. She stood, rooted to the spot, listening to the rest of the monstrous plan unfold in hushed, determined tones. When she finally dared to move, she fled. Not to her duties, but to the servants' quarters, her heart pounding a furious, outraged rhythm against her ribs. By midday, the truth was a silent fire raging beneath the manor's polished floors. It passed from Rosie's trembling lips to the cook's, to the stable hands, a current of shared, furious pity. The household, once a well-oiled machine of obedience, now trembled with a collective seething anger on Evelyn's behalf. They watched Elizabeth with new eyes, and they watched Gwen with a mixture of disgust and pity. The very next day, the bitter, telltale scent of wolf's bane vanished from Evelyn's tea. Elizabeth brought the cup herself, her smile a brittle mask. "A new blend, my dear. The healer recommended it for your strength." And as the days passed, a miracle, slow and subtle, began to unfold. Strength returned to Evelyn's body like a slow rising tide, washing away a little more of the debilitating weakness. She could stand at her window for hours without her legs trembling. The fog that had clouded her thoughts for so long began to lift, leaving a sharp clarity that was both exhilarating and unnerving. With this newfound vigor came a painful awareness of the silence that had fallen between her and Gwen. It was a presence in itself, this silence. It filled the spaces where Gwen's laughter used to be, where her hurried footsteps would pause outside Evelyn's door. Now the door remained shut. When they passed in the hall, Gwen's eyes, once so bright and open, would skitter away, fixing on a painting, a window, anything but Evelyn's searching gaze. It was a withdrawal as palpable as a physical shove, and Evelyn felt the loss like a constant dull ache beneath her ribs. "Are you avoiding me?" she finally managed to ask one evening, catching Gwen as she returned from a solitary walk in the gardens. Her voice was soft, laced with a confusion that bordered on hurt. Gwen flinched as if struck. She couldn't even lift her gaze, her eyes fixed on the intricate pattern of the floor tiles. I've been busy. There is so much to prepare for," she mumbled, the excuse hollow and thin. Evelyn reached out, her hand, now steady, no longer shaking, closing around Gwen's cold fingers. A desperate, fearful energy pulsed through her. "Gwen, please, talk to me. Whatever this is." She swallowed, the words her father had always spoken to them rising to her lips. "We are sisters. We face everything together. I wouldn't mind sacrificing myself just to keep you as my sister." The words, meant as a comfort, were a poison-tipped dagger to Gwen's conscience. She saw the genuine, selfless love in Evelyn's eyes, a love that was willing to bear any burden for her, and it shattered the last of her composure. A sob caught in her throat. She wrenched her hand from Evelyn's grasp as if the touch burned her. "Don't," she choked out, and without another word, she turned and fled up the stairs, leaving Evelyn standing alone in the cavernous hall, her outstretched hand hovering in the empty air. The confrontation Evelyn had hoped would bridge the gap had only carved it deeper. The following day, Elizabeth summoned a healer, a stern-faced man with the scent of pine and herbs clinging to his robes. He examined Evelyn, his fingers pressing against the strong, steady pulse in her wrist, looking into her clear, focused eyes. "The sickness has passed," he announced to Elizabeth, his voice echoing in the tense room. "Her condition has improved. With continued good care, she will be fully recovered within the week." Joy, pure and unadulterated, surged through Evelyn. This was confirmation, an official seal on the miracle she was feeling in her own body. She turned to Elizabeth, her heart overflowing with a naive gratitude that was as painful as it was genuine. "You did this, Mother," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her stepmother, clinging to the woman who had, in her mind, orchestrated her salvation. Over Evelyn's shoulder, Elizabeth's eyes met Gwen's, who had been standing like a ghost in the doorway. Elizabeth's gaze was cool, triumphant. But Gwen saw only the devastating picture, her betrayed sister, embracing the architect of her betrayal. The guilt was no longer a weight. It was a living thing, gnawing at her from the inside. She watched Evelyn's trusting embrace, saw the way her sister's shoulders, once slumped in weakness, were now straight and strong, and she knew she had facilitated this recovery for the most vile of reasons. She turned and walked away, the sound of Evelyn's grateful tears and the healer's clinical pronouncements following her down the hall. The silence between the sisters was no longer just unbearable. It had become a chasm, and Gwen stood on one side, knowing she was the one who had pushed Evelyn away, all while Evelyn, on the other side, still believed they were standing together. The silence in the days that followed was a thick, heavy shroud, broken only by the whisper of skirts and the distant, muted sounds of a life Evelyn was no longer part of. She spent her hours in a strange, suspended state, caught between the joy of her returning strength and the profound sorrow of her sister's absence. She could walk the length of her room without tiring, could feel the muscle returning to her limbs, yet the person she most wanted to share this victory with had vanished into the shadows of the manor. Then, the front door clicked open. The sound was ordinary, but the energy that swept into the house with Elizabeth was not. It was a cold wave of dread. Evelyn, drawn by some primal instinct, moved to the top of the grand staircase and looked down. Elizabeth stood in the marble foyer, her face as pale as the moonstone necklace at her throat. She did not remove her cloak. She did not call for a servant. She simply stood there, a statue of impending doom, the rolled parchment of the royal decree clutched in her hand like a weapon. Gwen emerged from the morning room, her own face a mask of anxious anticipation. "Mother?" she asked, her voice small in the vast space. Elizabeth's gaze lifted, finding Evelyn on the stairs, then shifting to Gwen. Her voice, when it came, was flat, stripped of all emotion, and all the more terrifying for it. "The lot has been cast." The entire house seemed to hold its breath. Somewhere, a clock ticked, each second a hammer blow against the silence. "It fell on us," Elizabeth said, the words final as a tombstone sealing shut. "Our house must provide the king's mate." The air crystallized. Gwen made a small, choked sound, her hand flying to her heart as if to keep it from beating out of her chest. Her eyes, wide with a terror she had nurtured for weeks, snapped to Evelyn. It was a look of pure, unadulterated panic. Evelyn felt the world tilt. The words echoed, but their meaning seemed distant, abstract. This was the fear that had stolen her sister, the shadow that had fallen over their home. And now it was here. Then Elizabeth's voice cut through the haze, cold and sharp as a shard of glass. Her gaze, unwavering and devoid of any maternal softness, locked onto Evelyn. "You," she decreed, the single word falling like a headsman's axe. "You, Evelyn, will marry the king," she continued. "Since your sickness, you haven't done anything tangible for this family. Now is the time to prove your worth." For a moment, there was only a ringing silence. The injustice of it was so vast, so absolute, that it couldn't immediately be comprehended. She was the one who had been sick, hidden away, deemed unfit for any normal life. And now, the moment she was well, she was to be thrown to the wolves. Literally, to be made a sacrifice to a broken throne. Her eyes, burning with the shock of the verdict, sought Gwen's. "Help me," they pleaded. "Fight for me. Say this isn't so." But Gwen, after one heart-rending glance that was a torrent of guilt, fear, and shame, turned away. Without a word, without a sound, she walked. She moved past her mother, past the staring portraits of their ancestors, and ascended the staircase, her steps slow and leaden. She did not look at Evelyn as she passed her on the steps. She simply disappeared down the hall toward her room, closing the door on the ruins of their sisterhood with a soft, definitive click. The betrayal was so complete, it felt like a physical dissolution. Evelyn remained frozen on the stairs, the strength that had so recently returned to her body now utterly useless. She was trapped, cornered not just by Elizabeth's cold calculation, but by Gwen's silent, devastating compliance. Later, as she sat numbly in her room, she heard the quiet sounds of the manor grieving for her. It was not in loud wails, but in the hushed sniffles from the hallway, the way Rosie quickly turned away, her shoulders shaking when she brought a tray of untouched food. They knew. They all knew the truth of what was happening, the cruel machinery of the plot that had delivered her to this fate. The whispers that slithered under her door were not of scandal, but of pity. They spoke of the kind, forgotten daughter being sent to a gilded cage, to a king who was less a man and more a monument to failure. That night, Evelyn did not rage. She did not pound on walls or scream her injustice to the moon. She sat by her window, looking out at the same world that had once offered her escape, and understood there would be no more stolen afternoons. The freedom she had just begun to taste was gone, replaced by the cold, metallic flavor of duty and betrayal. And as the moon climbed high, casting its silver light over a kingdom that had both cherished and abandoned her, she finally let the tears fall. They were silent, hopeless tears that soaked into the fabric of her dress, the only rebellion left to a girl whose fate had been written by a hand she had once called family. The morning of her departure dawned with a cruel, clear beauty. Sunlight streamed into Evelyn's room, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the air like forgotten spirits. The gown laid out for her was exquisite, a deep sapphire velvet embroidered with silver thread, a garment fit for a queen. Yet to Evelyn, it felt like a shroud. Every stitch seemed to mock her, a symbol of the glorious fate that was nothing but a gilded punishment. It was Rosie who came to help her dress, but instead of reaching for the gown, the maid closed the door, her back against it, her face ashen and her hands trembling. "My lady," she whispered, the words choked. "I cannot let you leave without knowing." Evelyn stared, confused. "Knowing what, Rosie?" What followed was not a gentle revelation, but a brutal unraveling. The words poured out of Rosie in a torrent of long-suppressed fury and pity, the whispered conversation she had overheard, Elizabeth's cold confession of the wolf's bane, Gwen's terrified complicity, the calculated plan to make Evelyn the sacrificial lamb to spare Gwen. She spoke of the household's shared secret, their silent grief and rage as they watched the play unfold. At first, Evelyn stood perfectly still, the words not yet forming meaning, like a language she had never heard. Then, piece by shattered piece, they began to click into place. The years of unexplained weakness, the bitter tea, her sudden miraculous recovery, coinciding with the king's need for a Luna, Gwen's devastating withdrawal, Elizabeth's triumphant smile during the healer's visit. It was not a puzzle anymore, it was a premeditated crime scene, and she had been the victim living blissfully in the middle of it. The strength that had returned to her body now coalesced into something else, something hot and sharp and dangerous. Disbelief curdled into a rage so pure it stole her breath. That rage then fractured into a heartbreak so profound she felt the very foundations of her soul crack. Every memory of a kind word from Elizabeth, every sisterly laugh with Gwen, was now tainted, poisoned more effectively than any wolf's bane. She did not cry. Not then. A cold, terrifying calm settled over her. "Thank you, Rosie," she said, her voice strangely even. She turned and finished dressing herself, her fingers steady as they fastened the clasps of the velvet gown. She was armoring herself for battle. She found them in the main hall, Elizabeth overseeing the loading of her trunk with an air of brisk efficiency, Gwen standing like a wraith by the fireplace, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. Evelyn's footsteps echoed on the marble. Both women turned. The words, when they came, were not a scream, but a whisper that cut through the room like a blade. "Were you feeding me wolfsbane?" The silence that answered was louder than any denial. Elizabeth's face went rigid, her eyes turning to flint. Gwen made a small, gasping sound, her hand flying to her mouth as a fresh wave of tears spilled over. "I called you family," Evelyn continued, her voice gaining a razor's edge of pain. "I trusted you. I hugged you and thanked you for making me well, when all you were doing was making me well enough to be thrown to the wolves." Her gaze, burning with a fire they had never seen in her, locked onto Gwen. "And you let her. You knew, and you said nothing." Gwen broke. A ragged sob tore from her throat. "Evelyn, I was so scared." "We all are." Evelyn's composure finally snapped, the shout echoing in the vast space. "But you chose your fear over me. You let her poison me for years, and then you let her sell me to save your own skin." Elizabeth stepped forward, her patience gone, her mask of civility shattering. "What does it matter now?" she hissed, her voice venomous. You told Gwen yourself you were willing to sacrifice. You said you would do anything to keep her as your sister. So what difference does it make? The blatant distortion of her own words, the sheer audacity of the cruelty, left Evelyn momentarily stunned. It was Gwen who reacted. "Mother, stop!" she shrieked, horrified, turning on Elizabeth with a fury of her own. "How can you say that? How can you be so cruel?" But the damage was done. The last fragile hope that any of this had been a mistake evaporated. Evelyn looked at the two of them, the one consumed by guilt, the other by cold ambition, and saw strangers. "The difference," Evelyn said, her voice dropping back to a deadened calm, "is that I would have chosen to sacrifice. You made me a victim." She looked at Gwen, her eyes holding a final, heartbreaking goodbye. "You were my sister." As she turned and walked toward the waiting carriage, Gwen crumpled to the floor, her cries echoing through the hall, a soundtrack of utter despair. Elizabeth stood stiff and unmoving, a queen of her own ruined kingdom. Evelyn did not look back. She climbed into the carriage, the plush interior feeling like a coffin. As the horses lurched forward, carrying her away from the only home she had ever known, the tears came at last. They were not the soft tears of a victim, but the hot, silent, scalding tears of a betrayed soul. They streaked the velvet of her gown and fell onto her hands, each one a baptism of salt and fire, washing away the girl she had been and anointing the woman of steel she would have to become. The journey to the palace was a blur of jostling movement and stark, silent grief. The grand gates, when they appeared, were not a welcome but a maw, swallowing the carriage whole into a world of intimidating splendor. Courtiers clad in silks and furs lined the vast hall, their voices a sibilant hiss of judgment and pity that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Evelyn kept her spine straight, the velvet gown her armor, her face a mask of calm she did not feel. She was a spectacle, the sacrificial lamb brought to the altar, and every whispered word, "Poor thing," the sickly one, "What a fate," was a tiny lash against her raw nerves. Then, all other sounds died as Queen Helen entered. She moved with an authority that required no announcement, her gaze sweeping the room and silencing it in an instant. Her eyes, the color of a winter storm, found Evelyn. And for a terrifying moment, Evelyn felt utterly transparent, every hurt and betrayal laid bare before that ruthless intelligence. This was the woman who had built a myth around her son to protect him, a she-wolf of legendary cunning and strength. Evelyn felt a primal urge to lower her eyes, to submit, but before she could, a new presence commanded her attention. The herald's voice boomed, "His Royal Majesty, Alpha King Julius." The crowd parted, and there he was. The air left Evelyn's lungs in a soft, soundless rush. The rumors had spoken of a cripple, a senile fool, a broken thing. The man before her was none of that. He was seated in a wheelchair, yes, but his shoulders were broad, his posture regal and unbowed. His face was all sharp, intelligent angles, with a strong jaw and eyes that were not clouded by confusion, but were a clear, piercing amber, watching the world with a depth and stillness that felt more powerful than any frantic movement. He was beautiful, in a stark, formidable way, and the dissonance between the gossiped caricature and the reality before her was so profound it left her reeling. The ancient mating ceremony began, a low chant rising from the attending elders. Evelyn moved forward on numb legs, coming to stand before him. The pitying stares of the court burned into her back, but all she could see was him. His voice, when he spoke, was low. It was steady, devoid of pity or arrogance, layered with a quiet strength that resonated in her bones. "You do not have to do this," he said, his amber eyes holding hers with an unnerving directness. "The vows are ancient, but your will is your own. If this is not your choice, speak the word. I will send you home with my protection. Your family will be safe from any reprisal." The offer was so unexpected, so fundamentally kind, that it disarmed her completely. After the manipulation, the poison, the betrayal, here was raw, uncompromising honesty, power offering freedom. He was giving her an escape route from the gilded cage, asking for nothing in return. She looked into his eyes and saw not a broken king, but a man who understood duty and who respected choice above all. Home. The word was ash in her mind. Home was a house of poison and lies. Home was the memory of a sister turning away. This man, this king shrouded in cruel rumors, had shown her more genuine honor in 3 sentences than her own family had in years. The silence in the hall stretched, taut as a bowstring. Queen Helen watched, her expression unreadable. Evelyn's voice, when she found it, was clear and carried a conviction that surprised even her. "No, my king." She took a final, decisive step forward, closing the distance between them. "I wish to stay." A fresh wave of whispers erupted, but they were background noise. Julius's eyes widened a fraction, a flicker of something, surprise, respect, curiosity, lighting their amber depths. The head elder stepped forward, his voice rising once more in the old tongue. The vows were chanted, binding their lives to the moon and to each other. Then came the moment of the mark. It was a ritual as old as their kind, the sealing of a mate bond. Julius reached for her, his hand surprisingly warm as his fingers gently brushed aside the fabric of her gown at the junction of her neck and shoulder. His head bowed. There was a moment of pressure, sharp and clean, followed by a warmth that spread through her veins like liquid sunlight. It was not a claim of ownership, but a recognition, a primal acknowledgement that echoed in her very soul. Then, it was her turn. She knelt beside his wheelchair, her movements unhurried, her gaze steady on his. She saw the question in his eyes, the slight tension in his jaw. Leaning in, she placed her own mark upon his skin, just above the collar of his tunic. Her teeth broke the skin, and as the taste of his blood, wild and powerful like a forest at night, bloomed on her tongue, she felt the bond snap into place between them, an invisible, unbreakable thread of fate. When it was done, a formal silence descended. A maid moved to wheel the king away, but Evelyn stepped forward, her hand resting gently on the chair's handle. "Allow me," she said, her voice soft but firm. A fresh wave of whispers erupted at the breach of protocol, but Evelyn ignored them. She pushed him, her movements careful and steady, away from the staring crowd, through a side archway into a quieter antechamber bathed in the late afternoon sun. He waited until the door closed behind them. "You could have left," he said, the hint of a question in his tone. Evelyn came to stand before him, meeting his gaze squarely. "Perhaps I stayed because the king I met is nothing like the one in the stories." A faint, wry smile touched her own lips. The rumors described a senile old wolf. They failed to mention he was handsome, Julius supplied, a dry, genuine humor lighting his amber eyes. "I was going to say sharp-eyed," she countered, the ghost of a real smile playing on her mouth. "But handsome will do." He laughed then, a rich, warm sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. It was the laugh of a man who had not found much reason for laughter, and the rarity of it made it all the more potent. "They also said you were weak and fading," he replied, his gaze appreciative. "It seems we are both victims of poor intelligence." From the shadows of the main hall, unseen behind a marble column, Queen Helen watched them. She had followed, needing to see the truth of this girl who had chosen the cage. She saw her son, not slumped in resignation, but engaged, his eyes alive. She saw the girl, not cowering, but standing with a strength that defied her story. And she heard that laugh, a sound she had feared was lost to him forever. Her stern expression did not change, but the relentless grip on her own heart eased just a fraction. This was not the disaster she had prepared for. This was something new. This was hope. The palace, which had first seemed a mausoleum of polished stone and echoing halls, slowly transformed into a sanctuary. The world outside its walls continued to spin a narrative of a pitiable king and his sacrificial bride. But within the private royal chambers, a different story was being written, one page at a time. It began with books. Julius's personal library was a labyrinth of towering shelves filled with histories, epic poems, and philosophical treatises. It was Evelyn who found her way there first. drawn by the familiar comfort of leather bindings and the scent of old paper. She was curled in a deep window seat, bathed in a pool of sunlight, when he found her. "I see you've discovered my only true vice." His voice came from the doorway, not with accusation, but with shared interest. She looked up, a smile touching her lips for the first time without conscious effort. "Is it a vice to seek company in stories when the one outside is so loud?" He wheeled himself closer, his eyes scanning the spine of the book in her lap. "The Ballads of the First Shift," he read aloud. "A bold choice. The metaphors are notoriously heavy-handed." "Perhaps I have a fondness for heavy-handed metaphors," she countered, her eyes sparkling. "They're honest in their intent, unlike the whispers of courtiers." He laughed, that warm, unexpected sound that was becoming the soundtrack to her new life. "Then you'll despise the commentary by Lord Valerius. He spends 200 pages arguing that the silver wolf is not a literal figure, but a representation of the tax reforms of the era." Their conversations became a daily ritual. They argued passionately over the motives of mythical heroes, debated the ethics of ancient wars, and found common ground in their shared disdain for the pretentiousness of certain contemporary poets. Evelyn discovered a wit in herself she had forgotten, sharp and quick, and Julius met her parry for parry. His mind as agile and formidable as his body was purported to be weak. Laughter, once a foreign sound in these opulent rooms, became as natural as breathing. It echoed during their meals, as Evelyn recounted her childhood escapades among the farmers, and Julius, in turn, shared dry, self-deprecating anecdotes about the absurdities of his royal upbringing. She never treated the wheelchair as an obstacle. She would simply move a chair aside to make space for him, or reach a high shelf without being asked, her actions devoid of pity and full of a simple, effortless practicality. One evening she was reading aloud from a particularly dense historical account, her voice bringing life to the dry text. She paused to pour them both a goblet of wine, and when she turned back, she found Julius watching her, his expression unguarded. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You have a way of filling the silence," he said quietly. "It's not that it's gone. It's that it's no longer empty." The air between them shifted, growing warmer, charged with an unspoken understanding. The affection that had been budding gently between them now reached for the sun. Rumors, of course, continued to slither under the palace doors. Tales of the king's declining health, of the queen's barrenness, of the farce of their union. But inside their chambers, such noise was meaningless. The only thing that mattered was the way his hand would sometimes brush hers as she passed him a book, or the way her laughter could pull a genuine smile from him when the weight of his infirmity grew too heavy. Queen Helen observed it all from a calculated distance. She saw the way her son's shoulders, once perpetually braced for disappointment, had relaxed. She saw the light return to his eyes, a light not of royal duty, but of personal joy. The hardened shell around him, forged by years of isolation and deception, was being gently, persistently softened by this girl who had been delivered to him as a pawn, and had instead become a queen. Helen said nothing. She offered no praise, no acknowledgement. But the orders to the kitchen changed. Evelyn's favorite fruits began to appear at the table. The strict schedule of court physicians was relaxed, allowing them more uninterrupted time. They were small, nearly imperceptible adjustments, but in the language of a queen who ruled with iron will, they were a roaring endorsement. The hope she had dared not feel was now a quiet, steady flame in the dark, and it was burning in the heart of the son she had fought so desperately to protect. The peace Evelyn had found within the palace walls was not impervious to the ghosts of her past. They arrived in the form of her sister, standing at the grand gates day after day, a solitary, pleading figure in a whirlwind of her own making. "Lady Gwendolen is here again, Your Majesty," a maid would announce, and each time Evelyn's heart would constrict. "She begs an audience." And each time her reply was the same, a quiet, firm command that felt like shards of glass in her throat. "No." She would then retreat to her balcony, a hidden vantage point from which she could watch the scene below without being seen. She would watch Gwen, her shoulders slumped in defeat, eventually turn and walk away, the picture of utter dejection. It was a ritual of mutual torture. Evelyn would stand there, her hands gripping the cold stone balustrade until her knuckles turned white, the love she still carried for her sister warring with the bone-deep betrayal that kept her rooted in place. It was a pain that festered, a wound that refused to close, and watching Gwen leave each time felt like tearing it open anew. One afternoon, as she stood there trembling after yet another refusal, a calm voice broke through her turmoil. "It destroys you to send her away." She hadn't heard Julius approach. He was beside her, his gaze not on her, but on the distant figure of Gwen retreating down the cobblestone path. Evelyn didn't trust herself to speak. She simply nodded, a single tear escaping to trace a hot path down her cheek. "Then why do it?" he asked, his voice gentle, devoid of judgment. "Because if I see her, I will want to forgive her," Evelyn whispered, the confession torn from her. "And I am not ready to. I am so angry, Julius. I feel like that anger is the only thing holding me together. If I let it go, I might just dissolve." He was silent for a long moment, watching her. "Or," he said softly, "you might finally begin to heal. The anger is a shield, Evelyn, a necessary one for a time. But you do not need a shield here. Not with me." His quiet understanding was the key that unlocked the floodgates. The whole sordid story spilled out of her then, not in the controlled, bitter tones she had used before, but in a raw, ragged confession. She told him of the years of weakness, the bitter tea, the horrifying moment Rosie revealed the truth. She spoke of the wolf's bane, of Elizabeth's cold calculation, and of Gwen's devastating, cowardly silence. She laid bare the entire architecture of the betrayal that had delivered her to his doorstep. When she finished, she was trembling, her body spent from the emotional purge. The silence that followed was thick with shared understanding. Then, he asked the one question that had the power to shatter her completely. His amber eyes found hers, vulnerable in a way she had never seen. "Knowing all of that, do you regret it? Do you regret marrying me?" The question hung in the air between them. Evelyn looked at him. This man who had seen the broken pieces of her and had not tried to force them back together, but had simply made space for them. This king who offered freedom instead of demands, who valued her mind, and whose laughter had become her sanctuary. A sob broke from her lips, but it was followed by a truth so profound it washed everything else away. She crossed the space between them, falling to her knees beside his chair so their eyes were level. Her hands found his, clutching them as if they were the only solid thing in a spinning world. "Regret it?" Her voice was a broken, tear-soaked whisper. "Julius, you are the only light I have known since the day my father died. Being here with you, it doesn't feel like a cage. It feels like coming up for air after drowning for years. It feels like coming home." The raw honesty in her words, the sheer, unvarnished truth of them, shattered the last of the distance between them. He cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking away her tears. His gaze dropped to her lips, and the world narrowed to the space between their breath. The first kiss was not one of royal duty or practiced passion. It was a slow, tender, hesitant meeting of two wounded souls. It was a question and an answer, a forgiveness and a promise. It tasted of salt from her tears and of a hope so long deferred it was almost painful. When they finally parted, breathing each other's air, the world had irrevocably changed. The shield of her anger lay at her feet, no longer necessary, for she had found something infinitely stronger in its place. From her own private study, Queen Helen watched the balcony, seeing the way her son's hand lingered on Evelyn's face, the way the girl's entire being leaned into his touch. She saw the moment the fragile bond between them solidified into something unbreakable. Turning away, she allowed herself a rare, genuine smile. The girl was not just healing her son. She was saving him. The silence in the sunlit receiving room was immense, broken only by the frantic rhythm of Evelyn's own heart. She stood, back straight, facing the door, a queen awaiting a subject, yet feeling like a terrified girl. The decision to finally see Gwen had been made in the warm afterglow of Julius's kiss, a conscious choice to lay down her armor. But now, with the moment upon her, every old wound throbbed in warning. The door opened. Gwen stood there, clad in a simple, unadorned dress, a stark contrast to the vibrant gowns she usually favored. Her eyes, red-rimmed and shadowed by sleepless nights, found Evelyn's, and the hope and fear in them were so potent it was a physical force in the room. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, Gwen's composure shattered. A broken sob escaped her, and her legs gave way. She did not walk, but collapsed to her knees on the cold marble floor, her body folding in on itself as if bearing the weight of every poisoned cup, every averted gaze. "I'm sorry," she wept, the words torn from the depths of her soul. "Evelyn, I am so sorry. I was a coward. I was so afraid of that life, of that king. And Mother, she knew. She knew how to make my fear louder than my love for you." She rocked back and forth, her hands clenched in her lap. "I knew about the wolf's bane. I knew, and I said nothing. I let her make you weak. I let her sell you to save myself. There is no excuse. There is only the truth and my guilt. I will live with it every day for the rest of my life. I don't deserve your forgiveness. I don't deserve to even look at you." Evelyn watched the torrent of remorse, the raw, unvarnished agony of her sister. The anger that had been a cold, hard stone in her chest for so long began to soften, warmed by the sheer, devastating truth of Gwen's confession. This was not the polished, calculated apology of a courtier. This was the utter ruin of a soul. She crossed the room, the sound of her footsteps echoing Gwen's quiet sobs. She did not speak. Instead, she slowly knelt on the floor beside her sister. The movement made Gwen flinch, as if expecting a blow. Evelyn reached out, her fingers gently tilting Gwen's tear-streaked face upward. The sight of her sister's profound misery, the mirror of the pain she herself had carried, was the final key. "I know," Evelyn whispered, her own voice thick with tears. "I know you were afraid, and I know you are sorry." She opened her arms. With a cry that was half agony, half relief, Gwen fell into them. They clung to each other on the floor, two sisters brought to their knees by betrayal and now held together by the fragile, enduring strength of forgiveness. Their tears mingled, washing away the poison of the past, not in a sudden, miraculous flood, but in a slow, cleansing tide. "I missed you," Gwen choked out, her face buried in Evelyn's shoulder. "Every day, I missed you so much, it felt like a sickness." "I missed you too," Evelyn whispered, stroking her hair. "I was so angry, but I never stopped missing you." When their tears finally began to subside, they helped each other up, moving to a settee by the window, their hands still clasped tightly, as if afraid the other would vanish. The formal distance was gone, replaced by the hesitant, familiar comfort of their old bond. "Is he," Gwen began, her voice hesitant, "is he kind to you? The king?" A genuine soft smile, the first Gwen had seen on her sister's face in what felt like an eternity, bloomed on Evelyn's lips. "He is," she said, "more than kind. He is good." Gwen let out a shuddering breath, a weight of guilt lifting from her shoulders. "The rumors, they are so cruel." "The rumors are lies," Evelyn said with a quiet conviction that brooked no argument. "He is nothing like they say. He's sharp and witty, and he—" She trailed off, a faint blush touching her cheeks. Gwen, seeing the unspoken happiness in her sister's eyes, felt a ghost of her old, teasing self return. "He what?" she pressed, a tentative smile of her own appearing. "Does he leave scrolls of bad poetry on your pillow? Does he try to impress you by reciting boring tax laws?" Evelyn laughed, the sound free and light, an echo of the girl she had been before the poison. "Worse, he argues with me about the historical accuracy of the ballads of the first shift. Can you imagine? He called the metaphors heavy-handed. The absurdity of it, the delightful normalcy of bickering over books, broke the last of the tension. They fell into easy, familiar gossip, not about courtiers, but about a husband, the conversation weaving a fragile but real thread back to the sisters they had once been. The reconciliation was not a perfect mending. The scars would always be there. But in that sunlit room, filled with the sound of their shared laughter and forgiven tears, something broken began, tentatively, to heal. The summons from Queen Helen came as the evening shadows began to stretch across the palace gardens, long and deep. Evelyn felt a flicker of nerves, but Julius, reading beside her, simply placed his hand over hers, his calm stillness, an anchor. "It is time," was all he said, his voice holding a strange mix of apprehension and resolve. They found Helen not on her throne, but in her private solar, the room intimate and warm, a stark contrast to her public demeanor. She stood before a roaring fire, and when she turned, the fierce, unyielding mask of the queen was gone. In its place was the weary, hopeful face of a mother. "Evelyn," she began, her voice softer than Evelyn had ever heard it. I watched you walk into a den of wolves expecting a monster, and instead, you offered my son kindness. I watched you look at a chair and see the man sitting in it, not the prison it represented." Her stormy eyes glistened in the firelight. "You gave him back his laughter. For that, you have a mother's gratitude, which is far deeper than a queen's." She then turned her gaze to Julius, a world of understanding passing between them. "The kingdom believes it is ruled by a cripple and his sacrificial bride. They believe the true power has always been mine. That ends tonight." Helen took a deep breath, her regal posture straightening as she delivered the truth that had shaped their lives. "From the time he was 10 years old," she said, her eyes locking with Evelyn's, "I made him pretend. The rumors of his weakness, his inability to shift, they were a shield I forged to protect him from the vultures in our own court, and a test for those who would seek his throne." Evelyn's breath caught. Her mind raced, reconfiguring every moment, every quiet strength she had felt emanating from him that so contradicted the myth. "And the test," Helen continued, her voice sharpening, "was to see who would choose him, not for his power or his glory, but for him. Who would see the king within the man, even when the world saw only a broken puppet." As the words hung in the air, Julius held Evelyn's gaze. There was no apology in his eyes, only a profound, waiting intensity. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion that spoke of coiled power, he placed his hands on the arms of his wheelchair. He pushed himself up. The movement was not the shaky, painful struggle of an invalid. It was the smooth, powerful uncoiling of a predator. He rose to his full, imposing height, his shadow stretching tall against the wall, dwarfing the chair that had been his cage and his disguise. Evelyn's hand flew to her mouth, a gasp trapped in her throat. The king stood before her, not as a concept, but as a physical reality. He was taller, broader, more powerfully built than she could have imagined. The man who had been confined was a force of nature, his presence now filling the room with an alpha energy that was both thrilling and terrifying. He took a single step toward her. "Evelyn," he said, his voice the same, yet somehow richer, freed from the pretense of frailty. The shock was a tidal wave, but as it receded, it left behind not anger, but a stunning clarity. She looked from the standing king to the resigned queen, and the pieces of the cruel, brilliant puzzle finally locked into place. "You stayed," Julius murmured, a question and a wonder in his tone. "Did you think I would be angry?" Evelyn whispered, her eyes swimming with tears, but a small, knowing smile touched her lips. "Did you think I stayed because I pitied a crippled king?" She shook her head, taking a step forward to meet him, her gaze never leaving his. "I stayed because the man in the wheelchair looked at me and saw a person, not a pawn. He offered me a choice when I had none. He valued my mind. I fell in love with you, Julius. Not your legs, not your throne. You, the man who gave me my freedom long before he ever stood from that chair." The confession, uttered in the wake of the staggering truth, was more binding than any vow. The air between them crackled with a new, profound intimacy. The last secret was out, and instead of pushing them apart, it had woven them together more tightly than ever before. Queen Helen watched, a single, silent tear tracing a path through her stern composure. She had built a fortress of lies to find her son a queen worthy of the truth. And in Evelyn, she had found not just a queen, but a soulmate for her son. The deception was over. The true reign was about to begin. The great hall seethed with a tempest of outrage and feigned concern. The most powerful nobles of Meldivia had gathered, their voices a roaring cascade against the vaulted ceilings. They had come to protest, to demand, to force a queen they understood to remain in power. "This is madness," bellowed Lord Theron, his face florid. "The kingdom cannot be handed to a cripple. He cannot lead, he cannot fight. We will be the laughingstock of the realm. Your Majesty, you must reconsider." Lady Isabel's voice cut through the din, sharp and shrill. "This sentimentality will be our undoing. The king is not capable." They were vultures, circling what they believed was a dying reign, their words laced with a condescension they had nurtured for years. They pitied the broken king and his tragic bride, and in their pity, they found their own sense of superiority. Queen Helen stood on the dais, silent and immovable as a mountain, her face a mask of cold stone. She let the storm rage, let them expose their own treachery and doubt. And then, just as the uproar reached its peak, a new presence silenced it. The massive doors at the end of the hall swung open. First, the guards snapped to attention, their spears hitting the stone floor in a unified, thunderous crack. Then, a hush fell, so absolute that the whisper of silk against stone was like a roar. Evelyn entered first. She did not walk with the hesitant steps of a victim, but with the graceful, unwavering confidence of a queen. Her head was high, her gaze sweeping over the assembled nobles without fear, without plea. She was radiant, a vision in royal blue and silver, her eyes clear and filled with a quiet, unshakable fire. She took her place beside the empty throne, a silent sentinel of strength, but it was the figure who entered behind her that stopped every heart in the room. He did not shuffle, he did not limp, he walked. Alpha King Julius crossed the threshold, and his stride was not that of a man unaccustomed to the motion. It was the powerful, predatory gait of a born alpha, each step echoing with a finality that shook the very foundations of the hall. He moved with an innate, effortless authority, his shoulders broad, his posture unbent. The rumors, the lies, the years of mockery evaporated in the sheer, terrifying force of his presence. He did not speak. He did not need to. He walked the length of the hall, the sea of nobles parting before him like wheat before the scythe. Their jaws hung slack, their eyes bulged in disbelief. The man they had called a cripple, a senile fool, was a pillar of raw, untamed power. He ascended the dais and turned to face them, his amber eyes now blazing with a light they had never seen, scanning the crowd. The silence was deafening, thick with shame and terror. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low growl that resonated in the bones of every person present, a sound of absolute, unquestionable authority. "You were saying," the 5 words were a verdict. Lord Theron took a stumbling step backward. Lady Isabel's fan clattered to the floor, the sound explosively loud in the hush. Julius's gaze was a physical weight, pinning each noble where they stood. "For years, you have spoken of my weakness. You have mocked my throne and pitied my queen. You have schemed in shadows, believing the one on the throne could not see you." He paused, letting the weight of their own consciences crush them. "I saw everything. I heard every whisper. I remember every scheme. And now, you will answer to your king." There was no protest, no argument. The arrogance that had filled the hall moments before crumbled into dust, replaced by a primal, knee-weakening fear. One by one, like dominoes falling, the nobles bowed. First the highest lords, then the ladies, until the entire assembly was bent at the waist, their faces pressed toward the floor in a gesture of total, terrified submission. Evelyn stood beside Julius, her hand finding his. She looked out over the bowed heads, not with triumph, but with a quiet satisfaction. The people who had pitied her now trembled before her king. The lamb led to slaughter was now a queen standing beside a wolf. The truth, once unleashed, was a fire on the wind. It did not simply travel, it consumed, transforming the landscape of the kingdom in its wake. It swept from the palace walls, through the bustling noble districts, and down into the very heart of the common folk who had long whispered their doubts and their hopes. In the sun-drenched marketplace where Evelyn had once found solace, the news landed not as a shock, but as a vindication. The blacksmith, hearing the report from a breathless courier, let out a roar of laughter that drowned out the clang of his hammer. "I knew it," he boomed to the cheering crowd. "I told you all. The moment that lass stepped into my forge, I saw the steel in her spine. She was never meant for shadows, only for a throne." Tankards were raised, not in pity, but in jubilant celebration. Their kind lady, the one who remembered their names and valued their crafts, was the queen who had seen the true king when all others were blind. Fate, they declared, had a way of righting itself, and their faith felt rewarded. At the manor, the news arrived on two separate currents, landing with vastly different consequences. Gwen was in the garden, trying to find peace among the roses her father had loved, when a servant, weeping with joy, ran to her. "My lady, the king, he stands. He is whole and powerful, and our Queen Evelyn stands with him as his true mate." For a moment, Gwen could not process the words. Then, the meaning crashed over her, and a sob of pure, unadulterated relief broke from her. It was not just joy for her sister's triumph. It was the shattering of the last chain of her guilt. She had condemned Evelyn to a cage, and the moon goddess had transformed that cage into a throne. The burden she had carried, the fear that her betrayal had doomed Evelyn to a life of misery, evaporated in the bright, cleansing light of this truth. "She is safe. She is loved. She is glorious," Gwen whispered to the sky, her tears now those of gratitude. Without a moment's hesitation, she turned and rushed inside, calling for her carriage. She would go to the palace, not to beg forgiveness, but to celebrate, to stand by her sister's side in this new, brilliant dawn. In the cold, silent study where Elizabeth spent her days surrounded by the ghosts of her ambition, the news arrived like a death knell. A maid, her voice trembling not with joy but with a fearful respect, delivered the message and then quickly fled. Elizabeth did not cry out. She did not move. She stood by the cold fireplace, her hand resting on the mantelpiece, and listened as the world she had tried so ruthlessly to sculpt was annihilated. The crippled king was a powerful alpha. The sacrificed daughter was a beloved queen. Every calculated move, every drop of wolfsbane, every whispered lie had not secured her daughter's future. It had engineered her own utter ruin and catapulted Evelyn into a glory Elizabeth could never have even imagined. A sound escaped her then. It was not a laugh, but a broken, hollow thing, the echo of a soul collapsing in on itself. The irony was a poison more potent than any she had ever administered. She had worked so hard to dim Evelyn's light, to hide her away, and in doing so she had ensured that light was preserved, pristine and pure. To shine at the precise moment it would be seen by a king who valued authenticity above all else. Her legs gave way. She slid to the floor, her fine gown pooling around her, as undignified as her schemes. The walls of the manor, once a symbol of her control, felt like a tomb. "Forgive me," she whispered into the dusty silence, her voice cracking. The plea was not directed at any living soul, for she knew she was beyond their pardon. It was a prayer to the moon goddess she had so blatantly ignored. It was a begging apology to the ghost of her late husband, whose gentle, trusting heart she had betrayed. And finally, it was a raw, broken sob meant for the daughter she had wronged. "Evelyn, forgive me." But there was no answer. There was only the weight of her own monumental folly. She had sought to control destiny, and in the end, destiny had revealed itself to be infinitely wiser and infinitely more powerful than she. The kingdom was reborn in light and truth, and she was left in the dark, alone with the crushing knowledge that every wicked thing she had done had only served to crown the one she sought to destroy. The throne of Meldivia was no longer a seat of solitary power, but a partnership forged in fire and sealed by truth. King Julius and Queen Evelyn ruled not as a figurehead and his shadow, but as two halves of a single, unstoppable force. His was the strength of the storm, the unwavering authority that commanded armies and silenced council disputes. Hers was the strength of the roots, the compassionate intelligence that understood the people's needs, that remembered the names of farmers and the struggles of artisans. Together, they brought a balance the kingdom had not known for generations. Laughter was no longer a rare sound in the palace halls. It was their legacy, echoing through the stone as they governed with a mutual respect that deepened with each passing day. The people, who had once whispered her name with pity, now cheered for Queen Evelyn with a fervor that shook the very foundations of the city. They adored the queen who had once walked among them in secret, who understood the weight of a harvest and the heat of a forge. Her past, once a source of shame manipulated by Elizabeth, was now a badge of honor, a testament to her character. She was one of them, and she was their queen. Gwen, freed from the gilded cage of her mother's making, became a constant, welcome presence at court. The bond between the sisters, though bearing the scars of betrayal, was stronger for having been tested. There were no more secrets, no more half-truths. Gwen dedicated herself not just to being a sister, but to becoming the loyal, steadfast supporter Evelyn had always deserved. Their conversations were once again filled with teasing and shared confidences, but now layered with a hard-won maturity and a gratitude for their second chance. And in the quiet manor, Elizabeth lived out her days in a self-imposed exile. The scheming, ambitious woman was gone, replaced by a humbled, solitary figure. She received no visitors, offered no opinions. The world moved on without her, and she was left with the silent, echoing company of her regrets, a permanent monument to the cost of treachery. But the heart of the kingdom, its truest symbol, was not found on the throne, but in the royal gardens under the full, silver light of the moon. There, surrounded by night-blooming jasmine whose scent hung heavy in the warm air, Julius and Evelyn walked, their fingers intertwined. They stopped beneath an ancient sprawling tree, its branches a lacework against the starry sky. No guards followed. No courtiers watched. There was only the whisper of the wind and the rhythm of their shared breath. Julius turned to her, his amber eyes soft in the moonlight. He brushed a stray lock of hair from her cheek, his touch as reverent as it had been on the day he first stood before her. "All of this," he murmured, his gaze sweeping over the palace, the gardens, the kingdom sleeping peacefully beyond, "began with a choice you made in a hall full of liars. You looked at a king offered to you as a punishment and saw a man worth staying for." Evelyn smiled, a true, unburdened smile that reached the depths of her eyes. "And you?" she replied, her voice a soft counterpoint to the night. "Looked at a girl offered to you as a sacrifice and saw a queen worth setting free." He leaned in, and their lips met in a kiss that was both a promise and a memory. It held the ghost of their first tentative kiss, born from tearful confession, but now it bloomed with the full, profound certainty of a love that had been tested by deception and tempered by truth. It was a kiss that spoke of a story which began not with duty, but with choice. A single, courageous decision in the face of despair that had blossomed into a love so radiant, neither destiny nor the darkest of deceptions could ever hope to extinguish it. Here, in the full light of the moon and their love, they were simply Julius and Evelyn, bound not by a throne, but by the unbreakable thread of the hearts they had freely given to one another. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't hesitate to drop a comment. I love hearing your thoughts. You might notice we made a few slight changes to our voice because of some situations beyond our control, so let me know what you think about it. A big welcome to all our new members. We're super excited to have you here. Don't forget to check out some of our other stories on the playlist. The link is in the comments. Until we bring another story your way, bye for now.